He heard his own son whisper to his wife that it was time to dump his father in a nursing home because he was nothing but a burden. The words sliced through him like a knife, leaving a wound no one could see but everyone would feel if they knew. This wasn't just betrayal. It was the kind of cruelty that makes blood run cold. After everything he had sacrificed, this was his reward. But what his son didn't know was that the man they were so eager to erase had one move left that would change everything. Subscribe now, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because the next part will leave you stunned. He sat frozen at the old oak table, the same table where countless family dinners had been shared, now feeling more like an interrogation chamber than a memory of warmth. His ears rang with the echo of his son's voice, each word replaying louder than the last, drilling into his chest. The room seemed to tilt slightly as if the walls themselves recoiled from the cruelty he had just overheard. His hand rested on the wood veins raised against paper-thin skin, trembling not from age but from the shock that his own blood had condemned him. He stared at the faint scratches in the table's surface left behind by decades of use, by Sunday roasts carved with laughter echoing around the room, by birthdays where his son once leaned forward eager for cake. All of those moments blurred into nothing, crushed under the weight of betrayal that felt sharper than any knife. He wanted to believe he had misheard. Maybe it was the television humming from the other room. Maybe the neighbors. Maybe his mind, worn from grief, was playing tricks. But the words were too distinct, too deliberate, too real. He's a burden. The syllables rang with finality, stripping him of dignity as efficiently as stripping wallpaper from a rotting wall. He closed his eyes, praying the floorboards would creak, that his son would walk in and laugh, say it was a misunderstanding. But the silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and told him the truth. This was no mistake. His chest tightened, the breath shallow, as if the air had grown toxic in his own home. The house smelled faintly of dust and old coffee, the sense of a life lived quietly, faithfully. But now even those familiar comforts turned foreign, hostile. The space that once sheltered him now bore witness to his humiliation. He felt his stomach knot, a sickening churn that threatened to rise in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt like a stranger in his own skin. He looked toward the mantel where his late wife's photograph sat in a silver frame. Her eyes, captured in that forever smile, seemed to watch him now with something else, something heavier than warmth. Was it warning? Was it pity? Or was it the silent demand of a woman who had trusted him to protect their family long after she was gone? He whispered her name without realizing, as if summoning her spirit might shield him from the blade his son had just driven through his chest. But the picture remained still frozen, and the ache only deepened. The old clock in the hallway ticked louder, each second landing like a hammer blow. Time mocked him. Every tick reminded him of the years he had poured into raising a boy who now dismissed him like yesterday's trash. He thought of the nights he had dragged himself home from construction sites, boots caked with mud, body aching from 12-hour shifts, only to stay up late helping with algebra homework. He thought of the times he skipped buying himself new clothes so his son could wear brand-name sneakers, so he could walk into high school without shame. All of it, every sacrifice, reduced to a whispered calculation of inconvenience. The sound of muffled laughter drifted from the hallway, the light-hearted tones of his son and his wife. Their voices, playful and conspiratorial, twisted the knife further. They weren't speaking of him with compassion or worry. No. They were scheming already, carving up his life as though he were gone. He imagined them pointing at his belongings, deciding which could be sold, which could be tossed. His heart pounded so violently, he thought the sound alone might give him away. He pushed back his chair slowly, the legs scraping against the floor like a scream in the silence. His body moved on instinct, carrying him to the small window overlooking the backyard. The garden lay in shadow, the rows of roses his wife had planted still clinging to their final blooms of the season. He remembered her kneeling in the dirt, coaxing life out of the soil with patient hands. Those flowers had survived storms, drought, and frost. He wondered if he had that same resilience, or if he was already withering under the chill of betrayal. The ringing in his ears faded, replaced by a dull roar, as if the world outside had grown distant, unimportant. He pressed his palm to the cold glass, grounding himself, feeling the sting against his skin. He realized he had not misheard. He realized there would be no gentle explanation. His son had spoken plainly, and the verdict was final. That knowledge sank into him like a stone dropped into deep water. His thoughts spiraled, darting from one memory to the next. He recalled the mortgage he refinanced so his son could buy a larger house, the savings he depleted to fund a lavish wedding, the quiet pride he had felt watching his son take vows under an arch of flowers paid for by his own calloused hands. Pride that now curdled into disgust. He thought of the way his son had smiled that day, a smile he now recognized as entitled rather than grateful. A shiver ran down his spine, though the house was warm. He realized the danger wasn't just emotional, it was survival. If they could so easily dismiss him as a burden, what else were they capable of? How long before whispered plans turned into signatures on papers he never agreed to? How long before the house was sold, the locks changed his life, boxed up and discarded on a curb? The truth was unbearable, but denial would be worse. He straightened his back, his breath finally steadying. The shock was still raw, but beneath it something colder and sharper began to stir. He had been blindsided, yes, but he was not beaten. Not yet. He would not let his son write the ending of his story. He would write it himself, and when the ink dried, it would be a story his son would never forget. The sound of footsteps creaked faintly down the hall. He pulled away from the window, his face composed, though inside the storm still raged. He lowered himself back into the chair, hands folded on the table as if he were simply resting, waiting unbothered. But in his mind, gears turned fast and merciless. Every scar from every year of labor had prepared him for this moment. He had built empires from dust. He could dismantle the fantasy his son believed was secure. The doorknob rattled softly, a shadow moving just beyond the threshold. He didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, his eyes steady, as though daring the universe itself to test him further. If his son walked in now, he would see only calm in his father's expression, not the devastation he had caused. He would never know the weight of the storm gathering beneath that calm surface. Because what they believed was weakness was only silence. And silence has a way of breaking louder than thunder when it finally speaks. What came next would not be forgiveness. It would be reckoning. And the reckoning was closer than they ever imagined. The image of his late wife rose unbidden, as vivid as if she stood in the doorway. She had trusted that their only son would honor his father, love him, protect him when she was gone. That trust was now shattered, and the shards cut deeper than any insult. He could almost hear her voice, soft but steady, reminding him of the nights they lay awake, worrying about their boy's future. She had believed in goodness and family and bonds that could not be broken. He wished she could see now how fragile those bonds truly were, how easily a son could sever them when money and convenience beckoned. Her photograph glowed faintly in the dim light, and he remembered the promise he had whispered at her graveside. He told her he would keep their family whole, that he would be strong for both of them. He had believed it then, but the betrayal now made that vow feel like a cruel joke. The hollow ache in his chest spread not just grief, but the bitter taste of failure. He had kept his end of the promise, but their son had abandoned his. He rose slowly, every joint protesting, and walked into the living room. The furniture bore the marks of decades, a coffee table with faint rings from beer bottles shared during football games, a couch sagging where his wife used to curl up with a book. The room was a museum of devotion, yet now it mocked him, each artifact whispering that his sacrifices had been wasted. He touched the armrest of her favorite chair, the fabric worn smooth. It still carried a trace of her perfume, faint but undeniable. For a moment his throat tightened and the tears threatened to fall. But he swallowed them back. Tears would not bring her back, nor would they change the truth about his son. He sat down heavily, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His mind replayed their life together, the choices they made, the paths they followed. He thought of the night they first brought their son home from the hospital. How terrified he had been to hold something so small and fragile. His wife had laughed softly, guiding his hands, telling him he was stronger than he knew. That strength had carried him through sleepless nights, scraped knees, college tuition, and weddings. But now, with her gone, he realized that strength was not just for building, it was also for surviving betrayal. The ache spread like fire in his veins as he realized the cruel irony. His wife had died believing their son would be her legacy, proof that their love and sacrifice meant something. Instead, that legacy had been corrupted, twisted into entitlement and greed. He wondered if her spirit could see this moment, if she looked down with sorrow or with rage. He wished he could ask her what to do. He wished he could hear her calm voice steadying his fury, reminding him that dignity could be salvaged even from ruin. But the silence was unbroken, and he was left alone with the ghosts of promises that no longer mattered. A car passed outside headlights, cutting briefly across the wall, and then the darkness folded in again. He noticed how the shadows seemed thicker now, like the house itself was grieving with him. He clenched his fists and forced himself to breathe evenly. The pain was still raw, but within it something else began to take shape. Pain was a teacher, and its lesson was simple. Never trust appearances. Never forget what people are capable of when tested. He thought of the last words she had spoken to him in the hospital, frail but resolute. She had asked him to take care of their son no matter what. At the time he promised without hesitation. But now he wondered if that promise included protecting their boy from himself, from the corruption that had grown in his heart. Could loyalty to her memory mean standing against their son's cruelty? The question lodged in his chest like a blade. His eyes fell on the bookshelf where a row of leather-bound albums leaned precariously. He pulled one out, dust swirling in the lamplight, and opened to a page of photographs. There was his wife, radiant in the sun, holding their little boy at a picnic. Another showed them at a school play, his son beaming in a paper crown, while he clapped from the front row. He turned page after page, each image another wound, each smile a reminder of innocence that no longer existed. The boy in those photographs was gone, replaced by a man who saw his father as an obstacle to be removed. He closed the album with a thud, the sound startling in the silence. He stared at the cover, his jaw set. Grief pressed down on him, but so did something sharper, a refusal to let that grief destroy him. His wife had trusted him to endure, to fight if necessary. The pain gnawed at him, but beneath it there was steel. He rose again and walked back to the kitchen. The clock ticked relentless, and with each second the ache in his chest transformed into clarity. He was not helpless. He was not finished. His son might believe the old man was too weak, too broken to resist, but that was a fatal miscalculation. He straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of years settle into determination. The house seemed to breathe with him, its walls holding not just memories but secrets. He remembered the safe hidden behind a false panel in the study, untouched for years. His wife had insisted on it. He had almost forgotten it existed. Almost. Inside were documents, accounts, deeds that no one else knew about. As the thought took shape, the pain in his chest shifted into something else entirely, purpose. He turned off the light and stood in the darkened kitchen, staring into the shadows, as if his wife's spirit might step forward. She did not, but he felt her presence nonetheless, urging him not to surrender. He whispered a promise into the silence, a vow that this betrayal would not define him. His son had drawn the first line, but the story was far from over. And as the night deepened, the pain hardened into resolve. What came next would not be grief alone. It would be something his son never expected, something that would strip the smug certainty from his face. The game had shifted, and only one of them understood that the reckoning had already begun. He felt the betrayal carve itself into his bones as clearly as if it had been written with a blade. Every sacrifice rose before him, sharp and undeniable. The long nights he spent hauling concrete under floodlights, his hands raw from winter air, just so tuition checks wouldn't bounce. The years he skipped vacations, skipped new clothes, skipped rest, convincing himself that a son's education mattered more than his own health. He remembered selling his old Ford pickup, the one he rebuilt with his father in a dusty garage, because there wasn't another way to scrape together the down payment for the house. That truck had carried every memory of his youth, and he had let it go for his son's future. Now the house that Truck bought was being discussed like prey to be carved up by vultures. The sting of betrayal was almost unbearable, but he forced himself to face it. He walked to the front window, staring out at the street where he once taught his son to ride a bike, steadying the handlebars as the boy's legs wobbled. He had run alongside, shouting encouragement, feeling pride burst in his chest when his son pedaled away under his own balance. That same street now looked cold, washed in sodium light, a graveyard of broken promises. His reflection in the glass seemed older than the man he felt himself to be. It showed a face carved by work and loyalty, staring back with eyes that finally understood how completely he had been used. He thought of the mortgage payments, the bills, the endless stream of emergencies that had always found their way to his doorstep. His son had called every time, voice heavy with need, and he had always answered, always written the check, always carried the load. It hadn't mattered if he had to take another shift or skip his own medication. He told himself it was what fathers did. He never once thought his generosity would become ammunition against him, proof of his supposed weakness. His body hummed with fury, but beneath it lay exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who had given everything only to be discarded like an old tool left to rust in the shed. He sat back down at the table, his hand tracing the grooves in the wood. His wife used to run her fingers over those same grooves when they argued about money, soothing him with her calm voice, promising that it would all be worth it. She believed their son would grow into a man of honor. Now, sitting in the silence she left behind, he knew the cruel truth: she had been wrong, and he had let himself believe the same lie. The betrayal pressed harder when he remembered how many times he had denied himself joy. He had turned down fishing trips with friends because he couldn't afford the gas. He had skipped fixing the leaky roof of his own place so his son's home could have granite countertops. He had lived with broken things, telling himself that one day there would be time to fix them. That day never came because every dollar, every ounce of strength, every dream had been redirected toward his son's happiness. And now that happiness came at his expense, calculated coldly like an entry in a ledger. The house groaned in the night as if echoing his thoughts. He glanced at the photographs lining the hallway, his son in a cap and gown, his arm thrown around his father's shoulders, grinning for the camera. He remembered standing there, bursting with pride, thinking every sacrifice had been worth it. Now those smiles looked hollow masks, worn by someone already plotting how to take more. He clenched his jaw, the muscles tight, his teeth grinding against the weight of rage. Betrayal didn't just wound him, it clarified him. It stripped away excuses, illusions, and left nothing but the raw truth: he was living under a roof where love had been replaced with greed. That realization steadied him. His heart was no longer just aching, it was hardening. He rose and moved into the study, the floor creaking under his boots. He opened the drawer of the old desk, the one he hadn't touched in months, and pulled out a ledger. The pages were filled with numbers, loans, payments, records of every sacrifice made. He flipped through them slowly, each line a reminder of how much of himself he had poured into a son who now spoke of him as a burden. He traced his finger along the ink, steadying his breath. Numbers didn't lie, and they told a story of devotion no betrayal could erase. But the ledger also told him something else: he had more power than his son realized. The deeds, the accounts, the signatures, his son thought they were forgotten, buried under years of trust. He almost smiled at the irony. They had underestimated him, mistaking silence for surrender. He closed the book with a soft thud and leaned back, staring into the shadows of the room. His wife's absence was heavy, but in that silence he heard something else: his own resolve. Betrayal had gutted him, yes, but it had also carved out space for something new. His son thought the game was already won, that the father was too weak to fight back. That arrogance would be his undoing. He rose, shoulders squared, the weight of the years no longer pressing him down, but lifting him up with purpose. The house was quiet, the night pressing close, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. Every detail, every memory of sacrifice, every scar was now fuel. He walked back into the kitchen, placed his hands on the table, and stared at the empty chair across from him. He pictured his son sitting there, smug and certain, plotting his father's removal. He let the image settle, then dismissed it with a breath. The son thought he knew everything, but he knew nothing. The betrayal cut deep, but it also awakened something far more dangerous than anger. It awakened patient strategy and the cold clarity of a man with nothing left to lose. He turned out the lights, leaving the house in darkness, and climbed the stairs slowly, each step measured, deliberate. He knew now what had to be done, and he would do it without hesitation. And when the reckoning came, his son would finally understand what it meant to underestimate a man who had given everything. Because a father who has sacrificed all has nothing left to fear, and that makes him unstoppable. He remembered the call only days earlier, the warmth in his son's voice, the easy way he asked about his health, whether he was eating enough, whether he needed anything from the store. For a fleeting moment he had felt reassured, convinced that beneath the distance and the silences, his son still carried a spark of the boy who once clutched his hand, crossing busy streets. That small hope had wrapped itself around him like a blanket on a cold night, fragile, but enough to keep him going. Now, standing in the ruins of that illusion, he realized the tenderness had been a disguise, a polished mask covering contempt. The phone call had not been an act of love, but reconnaissance, a way to measure what was left to take. The revelation cracked through him like a gunshot. His heart replayed the details, the little hesitations in his son's tone, the way his laughter had sounded forced, the pauses that once felt like thoughtfulness, but now revealed themselves as calculation. He felt his stomach twist at the memory of how he had thanked his son for the call, voice trembling with gratitude for a kindness that wasn't real. That gratitude had been a knife he had handed them willingly, a weapon used against him. He walked to the cabinet and opened the drawer where he kept the phone bills. The dates and numbers stared back at him, evidence of every call he had answered with hope. Each line felt like a record of gullibility, every conversation another stitch in the costume his son had worn to fool him. He felt sick at how desperately he had clung to the idea that family meant safety, that no matter how the world shifted, blood would remain a bond unbroken. But bonds could be chains, and chains could be cut. His son had severed it cleanly, leaving him free but bleeding. The silence of the house pressed down on him. He listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock on the wall, the distant murmur of traffic beyond the windows. All of it felt foreign now, as though he lived in a stage set rather than a home. The walls were the same, the furniture untouched, but their meaning had been hollowed out. The foundation of trust that once held it all together ripped away. He sat at the table again, his mind spinning through every conversation of the past year. The times his son had asked about the deed, the bank accounts, the insurance policies, questions he had brushed off as casual curiosity. He remembered how he had laughed, even proud that his son cared enough to think about the future. But it wasn't the future he was worried about. It was control, possession, the easy inheritance of a life's work without the burden of care. A bitter taste coated his mouth. He reached for a glass of water, but even as he drank, the bitterness lingered. He stared at the glass, watching the way the light fractured through it, thinking how fragile it was. One slip, one crack, and it shattered beyond repair. His hope had been the same, delicate and transparent, shattered by the truth. The betrayal was complete now. There was no room for excuses, no space for explanations. He knew his son's calls had been a performance, the kind that convinces an old man to lower his guard, to believe he still mattered. He realized how easily he had been played, how his love had blinded him. It was humiliating, but it was also liberating. When illusions die, clarity rushes in. He rose and walked into the study, the air heavier there, the dust of disuse settling over books and files, untouched for too long. He pulled open another drawer, this one deeper, filled with papers his son had never seen. Bank statements, contracts, investments he had made quietly over the years. He traced the edges of the folders, the weight of them grounding him. His son thought the mask of concern had worked, but in truth it had awakened something stronger, suspicion. And suspicion had driven him to prepare long before tonight. He closed the drawer slowly, letting the knowledge settle. The hope he had clung to was gone, but in its place came something harder, something that could not be broken by lies. He had clarity now, sharper than steel. The game his son thought he was playing was already lost. He stepped back into the living room where his wife's photograph still sat. For the first time that night, he did not look at her with sorrow, but with resolve. He spoke softly into the stillness, not as a plea, but as a vow. He told her he had believed too long in the idea of family as sanctuary. Now he understood that family could betray more deeply than strangers. He promised her that their son's mask would be ripped away, that he would see his own reflection in the wreckage he created. The night deepened, shadows stretching across the floor as the clock hands crawled forward. He stood in the center of the room, no longer burdened by the fragile hope that had deceived him. The hurt was still there, raw and deep, but it was tempered now with something more dangerous than pain. It was patience. It was focus. It was the cold fire of a man who would not be erased. And as he turned off the light, the house sinking into darkness, his mind was already moving, assembling the pieces, sharpening the edges of the truth. His son believed the game was hidden, the betrayal masked by false affection. But masks always slip, and when his son's mask fell, it would shatter louder than glass. What came after would not just be revelation. It would be justice, and justice was closer than his son dared to imagine. The house stood around him like a shell of its former self, every corner heavy with the echo of lives once lived, laughter once shared, and promises once believed. He had poured every ounce of sweat into its walls, his hands raw from years of hammering nails, sanding floors, and laying bricks one by one, until the structure stood as both a home and a monument to sacrifice. Now in the suffocating silence, it felt less like a sanctuary, and more like a battlefield already lost. The betrayal transformed the air itself, turning the familiar scent of cedar and old coffee into something sour, something foreign. He walked the hallway slowly, trailing his fingertips along the paint. His wife once chose a soft ivory that caught the evening light just so. Those walls had witnessed birthdays, anniversaries, even the quiet nights when she would hum softly while folding laundry. Tonight they seemed to conspire against him, whispering of deals made behind his back, of voices that dared to strip the house of its soul and sell it like common property. He paused by the dining room doorway, staring at the long table where Thanksgiving turkeys once sat golden under the light, where his son used to laugh with a mouth full of stuffing, where prayers of gratitude were whispered before plates were passed. That table was dust. Now its wood dulled its chairs empty. He could almost hear the hollow echo of imagined buyers walking through their footsteps, indifferent, their voices detached as they speculated about knocking down walls, replacing windows, erasing the very history he had fought to build. The thought sliced deeper than any insult his son could have spoken aloud. The kitchen was no kinder. He stepped into the tiled room, still smelling faintly of spices long faded into memory. His wife's recipe card sat neatly in a box on the counter, her handwriting delicate and looping each word a thread tying her spirit to the house. He touched the top card, remembering the way she used to stand at the stove humming while she stirred sauce, smiling when he stole a taste. That kitchen had been alive with warmth, but now it felt stripped bare, a carcass waiting to be picked clean. The betrayal of his son had poisoned it, making even the smallest relics taste of ash. He wandered upstairs, each step heavier than the last, each creak of the staircase a reminder that the house carried his weight, even if his own son refused to. At the end of the hallway lay the bedroom he once shared with his wife. He opened the door, the faint scent of lavender still clinging to the sheets, though she had been gone for years. The bed was neatly made, untouched, as if waiting for her to return. He sat on the edge, his hands pressing into the mattress, feeling the indent that still seemed to hold her shape. This room, once a refuge, now felt like a tomb. And worse, he knew his son would see it not as sacred, but as square footage, a space to be flipped, monetized, stripped of memory. The loneliness pressed tighter. Even the small office where he used to balance the checkbook and keep track of bills felt violated. He opened the filing cabinet, flipping through folders labeled with decades of history. Tax returns, medical records, the title deed for the house. Each page was proof of his devotion, every document a line in the story of a man who sacrificed everything. And yet somewhere in the shadows his son was already treating those pages like leverage numbers to shuffle property to seize. He descended to the basement where the air was cooler and the walls were lined with tools. He had built shelves, patched leaks, carved furniture with his own hands down there. His son had once joined him, a boy with wide eyes asking how to hold a hammer. He remembered the pride in teaching him, guiding his grip, smiling when the nail went straight for the first time. That memory twisted now sour with the knowledge that the same boy had grown into a man plotting how to evict him. The basement, once a place of creation, felt hollowed out, each tool mocking him with the reminder that he had built a future for someone who planned to dismantle it all. The loneliness didn't come only from absence. It came from the cruel presence of betrayal seeping into every room. He could not walk through the house without feeling the weight of eyes that weren't there yet, buyers already circling like predators, his son offering up the home for the slaughter. It was as though the walls themselves recoiled, as though they knew they were about to be stripped bare of history. He returned to the living room and lowered himself into his armchair, the leather creaking beneath him. The silence was sharp, punctuated only by the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. He stared at the firewood stacked neatly by the hearth, untouched, waiting. He remembered winters spent gathered there, his wife knitting, his son curled under a blanket, the three of them bathed in the glow of flames. Now the fireplace was cold and the wood would never burn for them again. His chest tightened, his breath shallow. He had not just lost a home. He was losing the only tangible proof that love and sacrifice had ever existed here. For the first time that night he allowed himself to whisper aloud into the emptiness. His voice cracked, his words trembling as they reached the walls. He asked his wife for forgiveness for believing their son was better than this, for letting her faith blind them both. His voice carried no answer, only the echo of loneliness. The silence answered him like a verdict. He was alone, and the house they had built was no longer theirs. Yet even as the loneliness wrapped tighter around him, another realization began to flicker beneath the pain. If the house could be treated like currency, if his son dared to see it as nothing more than an asset, then perhaps it could also become a weapon. His jaw tightened, his pulse steadying. The betrayal had turned his home into a prison, but it had also given him something else, the resolve to turn every brick, every board, every memory into the sharpest blade he had ever wielded. And as he sat in the silence staring at the walls that had once sheltered him, he knew the loneliness would not break him. It would harden him, sharpen him, and prepare him for what came next. Because the house might have been their battlefield, but he was about to decide who walked away from the war. The memories came back with a force he could not stop playing like reels of film across the dark theater of his mind. He saw himself hunched over the kitchen table late at night, a single lamp casting yellow light on the pile of bills spread before him. Tuition statements stacked high, each one stamped with amounts that seemed impossible at the time. He remembered the ache in his wrist as he signed check after check, the pen digging into the paper, his signature, a lifeline extended again and again. Every dollar was torn from his own comfort, every payment made with the quiet belief that his sacrifice was an investment in his son's future. He thought of the times he mailed those checks with trembling hands, praying the balance in his account would last until the next paycheck. Somehow it always did, because he refused to let his son fall. The images shifted. He remembered the call that came when his son lost his job, his voice breaking with shame, asking for help. Without hesitation, the father had reached for his checkbook. He had written out sums that emptied accounts, ignoring his own overdue bills, telling himself he could manage another month of bare cupboards. He remembered walking through the grocery store with his wife, carefully selecting the cheapest cuts of meat, rice, and bulk canned vegetables stacked in the cart. They had shared quiet meals, plain and unadorned, glancing at each other with a silent agreement. This was temporary. This was worth it. Their hunger was a small price to pay for their son's stability. The scenes layered over each other, sharper now, more cruel in the light of what he knew. He remembered pawning his wedding band once just to cover a sudden medical bill for his son. His wife had cried when he slid it off his finger, but he told her it was only metal. That love wasn't carried in gold, but in what you were willing to give up. He never told his son about that day, never wanted him to feel guilty. He wore a cheap band after that, and when his wife looked at it, he caught her eyes glistening with quiet admiration. They had endured everything together so long as it meant their boy had a chance to rise. He thought of the nights his wife skipped her medication so they could stretch the insurance money. She never complained, never asked if it was too much. She smiled through the pain, telling him it was all for their son. He carried the guilt of that smile now, knowing she believed those sacrifices would bloom into gratitude, not betrayal. Every compromise, every cutback, every sleepless night they had turned themselves into scaffolding so their son could climb higher. And now, standing in the ruin of their trust, he realized the scaffolding had been kicked away the moment it was no longer convenient. The memories grew heavier, pressing down on him like lead. He remembered working Christmas Eve shifts, coming home to find his wife waiting with reheated leftovers, the tree lights twinkling over the unopened gifts. He remembered missing birthdays, anniversaries, moments that could never be reclaimed, all so he could earn just enough to keep his son's path clear of obstacles. He remembered the exhaustion, the calluses on his hands, the sound of his wife's gentle voice telling him to rest, and the way he always shook his head, too determined to stop. He remembered thinking one day it would all pay off, that his son would see, would understand, would carry that gratitude forward. But that day never came. What came instead was betrayal, cold and deliberate. He sat there in the silence, the weight of those memories pressing into him, each one a wound that reopened under the harsh light of truth. The sacrifices that once filled him with pride now mocked him. They weren't seen as acts of love. They were seen as obligations, expected and forgotten, erased from memory by a son who had grown entitled to them. He rose abruptly, pacing the length of the living room, his breath sharp, his fists tight at his sides. The ghosts of his sacrifices followed him step for step, refusing to let him rest. He saw the faces of the men he worked alongside, men who had died young with broken bodies, men who warned him to save something for himself. He hadn't listened. He had given everything, every ounce of strength, every dime, every dream to his son. And this was what he had been repaid with, a whispered plan to discard him. The fire that had begun as grief now hardened into something colder, something sharper. He realized the truth of it. His sacrifices were not wasted. They had simply been misplaced. He had built strength not just for his son, but for himself. He had learned endurance, patience, cunning. Those same qualities would now serve a different purpose. He stopped pacing and stood still in the shadows, his face calm, his heart steady. The sacrifices he remembered were not just stories of the past. They were weapons, tools forged in hardship, ready to be used in the battle to come. Every sleepless night, every dollar surrendered, every dream set aside, had created a man who knew how to outlast storms. His son thought he had broken him. He was wrong. The house around him seemed to lean in the silence, almost listening. He lowered himself back into his chair, eyes narrowing, his jaw set. The past was no longer a weight. It was fuel. And with it he would burn away the illusions his son had built. Because sacrifices once remembered become debts. And debts always come due. He had carried the belief like a torch through every dark season of his life. The faith that his son would one day look back and recognize the sacrifices, the quiet battles fought in silence, the relentless years of struggle that had built the foundation beneath his feet. Gratitude, he thought, would be the bond that held them together long after his wife was gone. But that torch had been extinguished with a single revelation, smothered by the cruel clarity that his son did not see a father to honor, but an obstacle to remove. Gratitude had no place in his son's heart. Only calculation, only the impatient desire to clear the path of an old man who stood in the way. The betrayal hollowed him out, leaving the taste of ash where pride had once lived. He replayed the moments when his son's face lit up, opening a gift he had worked overtime to afford. The way he grinned behind the wheel of his first car, bought with money scraped from years of saving. He remembered the whispered prayers at night, the way he and his wife held hands and promised themselves their boy would grow up safe, strong, and loved. And now, in the same house where those prayers had once been answered, he understood they had been wasted. His son had learned nothing but entitlement, a hunger that consumed love and spat out resentment. The realization settled like stone in his chest. He was not a father in his son's eyes. He was a burden measured in dollars, a shadow stretching too long across the future his son wanted to claim. Every smile, every call, every word of concern had been nothing more than a mask hiding contempt. He thought of the last dinner they shared at this table, his son nodding absently while scrolling through his phone, barely listening as he spoke. At the time, he excused it as distraction, the busy life of a younger man. Now he recognized it for what it was, disinterest dismissal, a slow erasure of his worth. The ache turned to anger, sharp and precise. He rose and walked to the hallway mirror, staring at the reflection of a man lined with years of labor. He saw the weathered face of someone who had carried more than his share, who had built a life brick by brick, only to be treated as disposable. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. For the first time in years, he did not see weakness in those lines. He saw resolve. His son's ingratitude had stripped away illusions, but it had also awakened something more dangerous, a refusal to be erased. He returned to the living room, the floorboards groaning under his steps, and sat heavily in the armchair. His mind sharpened with every breath. He thought of the documents tucked away in the safe, the ones his son knew nothing about. He thought of the accounts still in his name, the deeds that tied this house to him and him alone. His son could plot, could whisper, could dream of a future without him, but those dreams rested on foundations he had built, and foundations can be shaken. The bitterness of betrayal did not paralyze him, it armed him. Each slight, each sign of disrespect, each word dripping with contempt was now fuel. He realized he had spent too long hoping for gratitude that would never come. Now he would stop waiting. Gratitude was a debt unpaid, and debts had a way of collecting themselves in brutal fashion. He stood once more, moving through the house with new eyes. The photographs on the walls no longer mocked him. They were reminders of what he had endured, of what he had built with his bare hands. The rooms, once heavy with loneliness, now felt like an arsenal. Every nail, every board, every brick was his, and he would wield that ownership like a weapon. The silence pressed in again, but it no longer suffocated him. It steadied him. He sat back down at the table, fingers tapping against the wood, the rhythm of a plan forming in his mind. His son had chosen to see him as a burden. Let him. He would show him what burdens are capable of when pushed too far. And as the night deepened, the shadows grew longer, his thoughts hardened into something immovable. Gratitude was gone. Love was gone. What remained was clarity. His son had drawn a line, and now it was his turn to cross it. What came next would not be forgiveness. It would be revelation. And revelation would cut deeper than betrayal ever could. He bent his head and studied his hands as if they belonged to a stranger. The skin was roughened into maps of work calluses at the base of the thumbs, faint scars near the knuckles where old nails had split under pressure, a faded burn on the left index finger from a winter long ago that he could still feel on cold mornings. Once those hands had been proof that he had built, mended, sawn, and carried, proof that he had been the backbone of a family. Now they trembled slightly when he reached for a cup, a tremor born less of age than of a sudden cold recognition that the world had reassigned him a new role, surplus an object to be managed, not a man to be consulted. The shame nestled in his bones like a weight. It did not shout. It worked quieter, more corrosive, an erosion of dignity measured in the small private moments that added up over days and months. Across the room the mantel clock clicked on without sympathy. The house contained the acoustics of humiliation, the polite murmur of his son on a phone call in the next room, the clack of a laptop where his son's wife typed schedules and spreadsheets, the occasional distant laugh that sounded rehearsed. There had been no outburst, no scene. That made it worse. The removal had been surgical, precise. He had been edged out with phrases, practicality, safety, what-ifs dressed up as concern, until there was less and less of him left in the life he had paid for. He tasted the residue of those words like iron in his mouth, and the taste made him angrier than tears ever had. He thought of the afternoon when his son had suggested with more tenderness than cruelty that maybe a part-time caregiver would be better, that the house was getting to be too much. The suggestion had been wrapped in smiles delivered as love. He had nodded, then embarrassed by his own vulnerability, grateful for an offer he believed was genuine. It was the moment the first stone fell from the wall. He had not noticed the crack. He had not heard the skid of mortar. Now the home that had been his triumph was a ledger entry in someone else's head. His hands had built tables that had fed children and patched roofs that kept out rain. Those same hands could be used to sign away what remained. The notion of being reduced to a signature sent a chill down his spine. Neighbors exchanged looks that hovered between curiosity and calculation. He could feel the tiny shifts in how people greeted him at the mailbox, the brief awkward pauses that followed when his son's name was mentioned with the property's value rather than its memories. It was as if the social contract had been rewritten. Kindness trimmed down when it became inconvenient. Empathy invested only where there was something to be gained. He had once been the one to bring casseroles to bereaved families, the one who could be counted on for a roof repair at dawn. Now gestures that would have drawn neighbors to his porch were bypassed in favor of gentle distance respect, turned into a currency to be traded or hoarded. Humiliation had a particular architecture. It lived in the corners where conversations stopped when he entered the room. It lived in the way his son's wife glanced at his clothes and then at the calendar, making mental notes about which days were the busiest and which tasks could be outsourced. It lived in the form rooms took when he walked through them, the kitchen rearranged with labels and storage bins, the living room shelves cleared of books he had read his son as a child. These were small violences calibrated to make him feel unnecessary without giving him an obvious reason to protest. The plan was polite. The execution was efficient. That efficiency honed resentment into something that burned lower and longer. He caught himself trying to explain the value of a single recipe card, the dog-eared page where his wife had written down a method for pie crust. It was a memory he loved, a ritual of hands covered in flour, of small flourishes that made a house feel like home. He rehearsed in his mind how he might remind his son that those cards represented a lineage of care, that they were the quiet proof of a life spent making space for others. The thought of being dismissed while recipes were cataloged by barcode and sold as part of a staged home tour made his stomach turn. He imagined a future where strangers would comment on the granite counters and the square footage, complimenting the aesthetic while oblivious to the history beneath the varnish. The humiliation became a slow, constricting thing when official language crept into their conversations. He watched as transition and options and planning replaced the intimacy of family talk. A social worker's pamphlet appeared like an emissary on the kitchen table, glossy and polite, listing amenities and schedules. His son assured him it was just information. His son did not mention that he had already made appointments, had already penciled in dates. The paperwork arrived with the quietness of inevitability. It was not a slap. It was a signature request. It asked him to consent to his own displacement in neat legalese. That procedural calm irritated him more than any shout could. There was a civility to this cruelty that made it harder to call out and harder to soldier against. There were humiliations no one else could see. He internalized them, the small, self-conscious adjustments he made in conversation to speak more clearly, the way he checked his own stories for relevance before he told them, trimming his words so he would not sound like an old man repeating himself. He had learned to laugh at the jokes that landed badly, to deflect the thinly veiled impatience with a grin that did not reach his eyes. He kept a calendar of family appointments in a drawer, partly to remember, partly to prove he was engaged, present, not the inert object they implied he was. Showing up had become its own kind of defiance. His attendance a quiet rebuttal to the claim that he could not manage. The nights were worst. When the house fell into its ordinary darkness, when the radio was off and the city lights softened at the windows, the loneliness hummed loudest. He would sit by the lamp and look over bills, old strewn records of payment and purchase, and count the cost of a life spent giving. He traced numbers with his thumb and could see his history spelled out in ink. Those entries should have been evidence of love, but now they seemed to mock him, a ledger of what he had given in the expectation of a return he had never received. A neighbor's dog barked, and the sound cut through him like a reminder. Time moved, seasons shifted, and people made decisions that left scars. He remembered the day his son had held him as if to steady him, and then after a pause suggested with a measured gentleness that maybe professional care would be better. He had let the embrace confuse him, let comfort masquerade as a resignation to fate. That confusion had sheltered him until clarity ripped the veil away. The shame of that confusion stung anew, but it also began to transform into something else, less a collapse than a recalculation. Beneath the humiliation, a different sensation unfurled, recognition of agency. He realized that shame had been granted to him like a gift by those who wanted him quiet. It had to be taken back. The hands he thought of as frail were not just relics. They were instruments he had used to shape a life. Those fingers had held a saw steady, had tightened bolts, had written checks and signed documents. They had also, in quieter hours, written notes to a wife, smoothed a forehead, steadied a trembling child. There was a memory in them of competence and stubbornness that did not disappear because others wanted it gone. He rose and moved through the rooms like a man walking past old friends. He paused at the study door, feeling for the hidden seam in the bookcase his wife had pointed out. Once joking that secrets were not only for lovers. It had been a half-joke, but now the seam mattered. There were things tucked away in unexpected places, papers, a second set of keys, a copy of a will, perhaps things not listed on a brochure. The thought of these small private bulwarks made his pulse quicken. The humiliation still lingered, but it no longer had the power to bend him to silence. The ache in his hands, the tremor, the way the world had sought to make him small, all of it fed a resolution. He would not accept the narrative assigned to him. He would not be reclassified into a line item. The quiet, persistent indignity pushed him toward planning, toward sorting papers, toward calling back memories and gathering proof. The house could be marketed, could be remarked upon, could be touched down in someone else's portfolio. But there were signatures, accounts, and old agreements that bore his name. Those formalities could be the instruments of his reclamation. He set his hand on the table, feeling the groove worn smooth by years of living. The wood was the same as it had always been, and under his palm he was no longer ashamed, but purposeful. The shame would be answerable. The humiliation would have a cost. He had been taught to build and to give. There was a finality to those skills he had not yet exhausted. What came next would not be loud. It would be precise. It would be calculated. It would undo the polite machinery of removal with its own quiet machinery, papers, dates, accounts, and the stubborn, unglamorous truth written in ink and witnessed by law. He straightened the decision, settling like armor. The house that had been turned into a ledger would become the battleground on which he reclaimed his name. The tremor in his hands did not vanish, but it steadied into purpose. He closed his fist once, not in anger but in resolve, and walked toward the study where the secrets waited to be tested. What he would do next would surprise them all. He lifted his eyes to the photograph that had hung on the wall for decades, its frame slightly crooked from time, the glass catching the dim lamplight. The image stared back at him, a frozen moment of a family that once pulsed with life. His wife's smile was wide and effortless, his son's laughter caught mid-burst, his own face younger, unlined by years of sacrifice and disappointment. That picture had once been a source of comfort, proof that joy had existed under this roof. Now it mocked him, each smile in the photo, colder than winter air, a relic that stung more than it soothed. The laughter captured there had long since dissolved into silence, leaving him to wonder how something so vibrant could decay into betrayal. He stepped closer, his fingers brushing the frame. The dust clung to his skin, fine and gray, like the residue of memory itself. He remembered the day it was taken, an afternoon barbecue in the backyard, the smell of charcoal in the air, his wife fussing over the salad, his son running barefoot through the grass. The click of the camera had been casual, unplanned, yet it had captured what he thought was eternal. He had told himself back then that this was what all the long hours and sacrifices were for, to freeze moments like that to build a home where laughter would always echo. But the walls around him told a different story now. The echoes had vanished, replaced by whispers of greed, conversations in secret, and the suffocating knowledge that the people in that photograph had betrayed the promise it once represented. The chill of memory spread deeper as he moved through the room. His gaze fell on the old piano in the corner, silent now, keys yellowed with age. His wife had played on quiet evenings, their son sitting beside her, pounding at the low keys with clumsy fingers. Music had filled the house back then, notes bouncing off the walls like sparks of light. He could still hear the faint echo if he closed his eyes, but the sound only deepened the emptiness when he opened them again. The piano was nothing more than a monument now, heavy and untuned, another symbol of how warmth had been drained from the home. He walked toward the bookshelf, tracing the spines of books his wife had loved. He remembered her voice reading them aloud, her tone playful, alive, while their son curled up in pajamas on the couch. Those books once carried bedtime adventures, lessons in kindness, worlds to explore together. Now they sagged against each other in silence, gathering dust, waiting for strangers to box them up when the house was eventually sold. Each title stabbed him with a reminder the joy of those nights had been traded for cold calculations and whispered betrayals. His steps carried him back to the hallway, past the coat still hanging on hooks. His wife's favorite sweater was there untouched, since she had passed the faintest trace of her perfume lingering. He buried his face in the wool, desperate for warmth, but it offered none. The scent only sharpened his loss, and the sweater fell heavy in his hands. He hung it back carefully, but the act felt final, like returning her ghost to its place in a museum of broken promises. Even the staircase seemed to mourn, as he ascended each creak, a hollow echo of footsteps long gone. He paused midway, glancing at the wall lined with smaller photographs, school portraits of his son, family vacations, his wife holding sparklers on the 4th of July. Once they had been milestones, trophies of a family's journey. Now they were mile markers on a road that led straight to betrayal. He touched one frame, his reflection merging with the younger version of himself in the photo, and it struck him with brutal clarity he had become a stranger in his own home, an intruder among ghosts of better days. In the bedroom, the coldness of memory pressed hardest. He sat on the edge of the bed he had once shared with his wife, staring at the quilt she had sewn by hand. Each patch was a piece of their life together, scraps of fabric from his old shirts, pieces of curtains from their first apartment patterns she had chosen with care. He remembered lying beneath it with her, talking quietly about their son's future, believing that every choice they made would build him a stronger life. The quilt warmed them then. Now it chilled him with the reminder that every stitch had been made in vain. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling where cracks spread like veins. His wife had wanted to repaint once, but he had promised to get to it, always too busy working extra shifts or fixing something else. The cracks remained widening year by year until they became part of the house itself. They mirrored the fracture in his family, small at first, easy to ignore, but now yawning open, impossible to repair. The weight of memory was suffocating. It wasn't just the loss of his wife or the betrayal of his son. It was the knowledge that everything they had built together, the dinners, the holidays, the laughter captured in photographs, had been dismantled piece by the very person they had sacrificed for. Every object in the house was evidence. Every memory a weapon turned against him. He stood moving back downstairs, each step deliberate, his face expressionless, though his chest ached. The living room greeted him again with its silence. He stared once more at the family photograph on the wall. The smiles looked different now. Not joyful, not innocent. They looked like masks, fragile veneers stretched over futures that would never come. The coldness of memory settled into something harder than grief. It transformed into resolve. He understood now that those memories, as painful as they were, could no longer hold him prisoner. They were lessons, reminders of how easily trust could be betrayed, how quickly warmth could be extinguished. They sharpened his vision, made his path clearer. He reached up and straightened the crooked frame, his hand steady. The photo no longer mocked him. It challenged him. It dared him to take back what had been stolen, to honor the sacrifices not with nostalgia, but with action. The laughter in the picture would never return, but the reckoning it demanded was very much alive. The house was cold with memory, but beneath that frost something stirred, something that would not remain still. And as he stepped back, the photo gleaming under the dim light, he knew the next chapter would not be written in silence. It would be carved out with precision, and it would change everything. The truth struck him like a cold blade, clean and merciless. He had spent months, maybe years, convincing himself that patience and silence were virtues, that by keeping the peace he was preserving some fragile thread of family left behind after his wife's death. But silence had not protected him. It had armed them. It had given his son the confidence to whisper plans in the open, to treat him not as a father, but as a hurdle to be cleared. He saw it clearly now. If he continued to say nothing, to let the humiliation slide past him unchallenged, he would not just lose his place in this house. He would vanish, entirely erased from the life he had built with his own hands. The realization did not come with rage or shouting. It came with stillness, the kind that makes a man dangerous. He sat back in his chair, shoulders straightening, his eyes fixed on the walls that had once sheltered love and laughter. He saw them now as lines in a battlefield, every corner and every memory a position to defend. He imagined himself fading into the margins, watching strangers walk through these rooms, his name stripped from the deed, his voice dismissed as irrelevant. The picture burned so vividly in his mind that it tightened his jaw and steadied his hands. That was not how his story would end. He rose slowly, pacing the length of the living room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. With each step he remembered another moment of silence, another time he had bitten back the words he should have spoken. When his son dismissed his opinions about repairs on the house, he had said nothing. When his daughter-in-law rearranged the kitchen and called it efficiency, he had smiled politely. When the conversations turned cold, when invitations dwindled, when his presence became optional, he had told himself it was temporary. But tonight stripped all illusions away. It had never been temporary. It had been a strategy, and he had been complicit in his own removal. He stopped by the window, staring out at the street glowing faintly under the lamplight. How many times had he stood here waiting for his son to come home late, anxious until the headlights finally pulled into the drive? How many times had he prayed for his boy's safety, whispered promises to his wife that he would keep their child safe, no matter the cost? Now the same son plotted to unseat him, to exile him from the home that had been his wife's dream as much as his own. The betrayal was bitter, but the clarity it brought was sharper still. His reflection in the glass was lined and weathered, but his eyes burned with something new. He was no longer the man who would nod quietly and absorb the blows. He was no longer the father who would excuse cruelty as stress or misinterpret contempt as distraction. He saw himself as he truly was, a man who had built, provided, sacrificed, and endured, and a man who would no longer be silent while others dismantled his life piece by piece. He turned back into the room, letting his gaze sweep over the furniture, the photographs, the artifacts of decades of work and love. He realized that this house, this sanctuary, had been constructed not just from wood and brick, but from his silence too. Every time he had swallowed his voice, another nail had been hammered into his own coffin. No more. His silence had been mistaken for weakness, and that mistake would become his greatest advantage. They had no idea what kind of man they had provoked. The weight of his wife's absence pressed in, but it no longer crippled him. Instead, it fueled him. He remembered her words spoken years ago in the kitchen after a particularly harsh argument with their son. "Don't let him forget who you are. Don't let him think your strength is gone." He had ignored her advice, then hoping time would heal the fractures. Now he knew she had seen the truth long before he did. He whispered into the quiet room, promising her that he would no longer betray himself with silence. The air in the house shifted. It was subtle, but he felt it. The loneliness that had pressed down on him like a coffin lid was gone, replaced with the electric hum of intent. He sat at the table again, his fingers drumming against the wood, not in anxiety, but in rhythm, like the slow beat of a war drum. He no longer felt the sting of humiliation. He felt the clarity of a man who had finally decided to fight. He imagined the days ahead, the conversations that would come. He would not shout. He would not beg. He would not plead for the respect that was his by right. He would move carefully, deliberately, wielding the knowledge and resources they had long forgotten he possessed. Every account, every document, every scrap of proof that tied this home and its legacy to his name would be his weapons. His son thought him obsolete, but he was about to learn that age does not erase power, it sharpens it. The house around him seemed to listen as though it too had been waiting for this moment of awakening. The ticking clock on the mantel no longer mocked him. It counted down. His time of silence had ended and the time of reckoning had begun. And as he leaned back, his eyes narrowing in the dim glow, he thought of his son's voice whispering in the other room, so confident, so sure of his control. That voice would soon falter. That certainty would soon crack. Because the man they thought they had defeated was no longer hiding in silence. He had woken, and he was ready. What came next would not be quiet. It would be the sound of truth shattering the illusions they had built, and it would change everything. The flame began as a spark deep in his chest, faint but unmistakable, a surge of heat that cut through the chill of humiliation. For too long he had sat back and allowed himself to be treated as if his will no longer mattered, as though he were nothing more than an old man waiting for permission to breathe. That illusion shattered now. He felt it burn in his veins, steady and slow, a fire not of rage but of resolve. He would not be maneuvered like a pawn across a board designed by others. He had built this house, this life, with sweat and sacrifice, and no whispered conspiracy could strip him of his place in it. He straightened in his chair spine, tall shoulders squared. The fatigue that had bent him seemed to slough away, replaced by something taut, alive. His eyes moved across the room, no longer dulled by grief but sharpened by intent. Every corner of the house carried a memory, and now each one became a reason to fight. The living room where he had watched his son take his first steps. The staircase where his wife once leaned against the rail laughing at something trivial yet unforgettable. The kitchen table scarred by decades of meals and bills where plans had been made for a family that was supposed to stand together. They were not relics. They were battlements. He rose to his feet and paced slowly, measuring the space like a soldier surveying terrain. His mind catalogued details with surgical precision. The deed to the house locked away in his study. The accounts his son did not know existed. The safe deposit box at the bank containing papers and photographs that tied every sacrifice back to his name. His son might have assumed age had dulled his mind, but age had only taught him to hide his strength in plain sight. Let them believe he was harmless. It was the perfect disguise. He stepped to the window, pulling aside the curtain. The street outside was quiet, bathed in the orange glow of the lampposts. Years ago he had stood in this same spot waiting for his son to come home, late relief washing over him, when headlights finally turned into the driveway. Now he looked out with colder eyes. The same road that had once delivered his boy safely back was the road that might one day carry him away in shame. But not yet. Not before he taught him a lesson that would sear itself into memory. He let the curtain fall and returned to the table where his hands pressed flat against the wood. The tremor was gone. His palms were steady, his heartbeat measured. The fire inside him did not roar. It smoldered with control, patient and deliberate. He had no interest in shouting matches or pleading for respect. That would give them too much. What he intended was quieter, sharper, the kind of vengeance that didn't announce itself until it was too late to escape. He thought of his wife, her face glowing in the old photograph. She had always seen the steel beneath his calm, had always told him he carried a strength others underestimated. Tonight her voice echoed in his memory, urging him not to surrender, not to allow their years together to be reduced to a signature on a contract prepared by greedy hands. He whispered a vow to her, promising he would not let their sacrifices be erased. The fire spread, filling him with a clarity that made every sound sharper, every detail vivid. He noticed the hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the clock, the rustle of branches outside the window. Even the silence upstairs carried meaning. The house was alive, and it waited for his decision. He moved toward the study, the old floorboards groaning beneath him as if they too bore witness. He opened the door, flicked on the lamp, and sat at the desk that had anchored decades of responsibility. The drawers slid open under his hands, revealing the documents he had kept safe. Bank statements, investment records, the original deed. His name was everywhere. Not his son's. His. He traced the ink of his signature with one finger, the certainty solidifying in his chest. This was his power, not nostalgia, but fact written into law and history. His son's whispers meant nothing against the weight of those pages. He leaned back in the chair, eyes narrowing. If they wanted to play a game, he would be the one writing the rules. The fire grew stronger as he imagined the moment to come, the look on his son's face when he realized the man he thought weak and expendable had been preparing all along. That moment would be worth every ounce of patience, every quiet night of suffering. It would be the turning point, the day the son who thought himself clever discovered what it truly meant to underestimate a father. He closed the folder and locked it away again, his movements calm, deliberate. He was not rushing. The flame inside him was not reckless. It was the fire of a craftsman, someone who knew the value of precision, who had built entire homes with his hands and could just as easily dismantle one with strategy. He stood in the study doorway, looking out into the house. The shadows stretched long, the silence pressing in, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a stage waiting for its first line. He was ready to step onto it, ready to turn quiet humiliation into controlled power. And as he switched off the lamp and let the room fall back into darkness, the flame burned steady inside him, unwavering. He would not be moved like a pawn. He would not be erased. The fire had only just begun, and when it reached its peak, it would consume everything his son thought he controlled. What came after would not be negotiation. It would be revelation, and revelation would leave scars his son would never forget. Each word his son had spoken, each venomous whisper he wasn't supposed to hear, played on a loop in his head. They were meant to cut him down, to brand him useless, to push him toward quiet surrender. But the sting of those words did something unexpected. They hardened him. What was once pain became fuel. Every cruel syllable was a spark feeding the fire that now raged steady inside him. The voice of betrayal meant to break him, instead forged him into something sharper, something unmovable. His son had given him a gift without realizing it, the gift of fury tempered into strength. He sat at the table again, recalling the exact phrasing, the dismissive tone, the casual cruelty. "He's nothing but a burden." The sentence no longer crushed him. It clarified him. A burden is carried, ignored, resented. He would not be carried. He would stand, and he would remind them what weight truly meant. He had carried the family for decades through debt, illness, hunger, and grief. He had been their spine. And if they thought him a burden now, they had forgotten the strength of that spine. He would remind them in ways they could not ignore. His hands, once trembling, pressed firmly against the wood. He felt the calluses bite into the surface, a tactile reminder of a lifetime of work. He had built this home, balanced bills on pennies, turned empty cupboards into meals. He had taught his son how to walk, how to drive, how to face the world. And now that same son dared to strip him of dignity. The irony did not weaken him. It sharpened his resolve. The boy who spat venom had learned nothing of strength. But he would learn. The house around him seemed to echo with ghosts of those words. He could hear them in the creak of the stairs, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock. Instead of torment, they became a rhythm, a chant that urged him forward. Every insult was a hammer strike forging steel. Every slight was a weight added to his resolve. What was once humiliation became a chorus of reminders. He had been underestimated, An underestimation was the most dangerous mistake anyone could make. He rose from his chair with purpose, moving through the house like a man on patrol. He paused at the fireplace, the cold ashes inside still faintly smelling of old winters. He remembered evenings when he stoked the flames for his family, the way his son curled up on the rug drowsy in the warmth. That boy was gone, replaced by a man drunk on greed. But the father who once bent over those flames was still here, and the fire he tended then was nothing compared to the one blazing inside him now. He moved to the study again, unlocking the drawer with calm precision. The documents were there, silent and powerful. Deeds, bank records, investments. Pages that bore his name, not his son's. Proof that the empire they thought they controlled had been built on foundations he alone commanded. He spread them across the desk, his eyes scanning line after line. Every number was a weapon. Every signature a shield. He gathered them not with panic but with the quiet confidence of a general counting his troops. The words of betrayal echoed again, but now they were countered by another sound, his own inner voice, steady and unyielding. It told him he was not broken. It told him that his son's contempt was not a prophecy, but a miscalculation. It told him that the very cruelty meant to bury him had awakened him. He no longer saw himself as the old man in the corner, waiting for permission to exist. He saw himself as the storm they did not expect, the reckoning that would arrive not with noise, but with inevitability. He closed the files and leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. The silence of the house pressed in, but this time it did not suffocate. It amplified his strength. The insults, the dismissal, the betrayal, they no longer lived as wounds. They lived as weapons in his arsenal. The fire inside him was no longer a fragile flame. It was a furnace, steady and consuming, turning every shard of pain into iron. He thought again of his wife, her memory no longer a source of sorrow, but a pillar of strength. She had trusted him to stand firm, to carry himself with dignity, even when the world turned cruel. He whispered to her memory that he would not fail. Not now. Not when the stakes were higher than ever. He would not let her sacrifices or his own be erased by the selfish ambitions of their son. The clock ticked louder, its rhythm now aligned with his heartbeat. Time was no longer his enemy. Time was his ally, a countdown to the moment when truth would eclipse deception. He imagined his son's face when the reckoning came, the dawning realization that the man he thought broken had been preparing all along. That vision steadied him more than anything else. He stood once more, gathering the papers, tucking them away carefully. The insult of being called a burden still lingered, but it no longer hurt. It empowered. He was not a burden. He was the foundation, the architect, the survivor. And the man his son dismissed so easily was about to show him what true strength looked like. The night deepened, the house sinking into shadows, but he remained upright, unshaken. His fire would not burn out. It would grow, fed by every cruel word, every betrayal, every attempt to erase him. The pain had been transformed into purpose, the humiliation into resolve. What came next would not just be defense, it would be reclamation. And when it came, no one in that house would ever mistake his silence for weakness again. The drawer slid open with a low groan, as if the wood itself resisted the secrets it had guarded for years. He reached inside his fingers, brushing against the worn edges of folders that had not been touched since his wife carefully organized them. The air carried a faint scent of paper and dust mingled with her memory. Slowly he drew the stack out and laid it across the desk, the weight of it heavier than its size suggested. These were not just documents. They were weapons. Deeds, savings books, investment receipts, contracts signed decades ago, proof of everything he had built, and everything they believed forgotten. He spread them open one by one under the warm glow of the desk lamp. His name was there in bold ink, repeated over and over like a declaration. The house deed carried his signature, firm and unwavering, from a younger hand. The savings book showed deposits stretching back to days when he and his wife skipped meals so their son could have enough. There were investment papers his son never knew existed, quiet acts of foresight he had made in case of emergencies. The irony struck him like a cruel joke. All these years, he had been protecting a family that now plotted to discard him. And yet these very protections would become the shield that saved him. He sat back in the chair, running a hand over his face. The fire inside him steadied, no longer wild but focused. His humiliation had given way to clarity. If his son thought he could maneuver him into a corner, he would soon learn that the man he underestimated had already mapped the exits. Each paper was a lifeline, a chess piece his son had overlooked, and he would place them carefully, not with haste but with precision. This was no longer about survival. It was about reclamation. He picked up the house deed again, tracing the embossed seal with his thumb. His wife had insisted they keep it in a safe place, her voice echoing in his memory. "Never let go of this. It's more than paper. It's our life." At the time he thought she was being sentimental. Now he understood her wisdom. This house was not just wood and stone. It was the battlefield, and the deed was the crown. Whoever held it held the future, and he held it firmly in his hands. A slow plan began to shape itself in his mind. He could see the steps unfolding one after another like a trail lit in the dark. He would make copies, secure them where no one could touch. He would speak to the banker who had known him for decades, the man who still respected him, not his son. He would recheck the clauses in his will, ensuring no careless detail left him vulnerable. And most importantly, he would make certain that when his son thought he had stripped him of everything, the truth would arrive like a hammer blow. The old man was still in control. He stood and carried the papers to the safe in the corner, an old steel box hidden behind a cabinet. The lock clicked open under his steady hands. He placed the documents inside with reverence, as though laying down tools before a battle. But he didn't close it immediately. He lingered, staring at the evidence of a life lived in sacrifice. The numbers, the seals, the signatures, they were no longer just records. They were the bones of his legacy, and he would not allow them to be stolen. Closing the safe with a decisive snap, he straightened and looked around the room. The shadows seemed to shift, the house no longer suffocating but standing at his side. The loneliness that had haunted him in earlier nights was gone, replaced by a sense of alliance. He was not alone. The walls, the memories, the very structure of the home were with him. His wife's careful organization, her foresight had armed him beyond what his son could imagine. He moved back to the desk and lit another lamp, the light spilling wider, chasing away the dark. His mind sharpened with every passing second. The betrayal had wounded him, but it had also given him something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. No more waiting, no more silence. Action was the only language left, and he would speak it fluently. The plan continued to take shape. He would not confront his son immediately. No, that would be too easy, too expected. He would let him continue his whispered plotting, let him feel the false comfort of control. Meanwhile, he would weave his own net thread by thread, so that when the moment came, the trap would close with finality. His son would not just be denied victory. He would be forced to see the man he had dismissed rise taller than ever. He thought of the look that would spread across his son's face, the shock that would ripple when the truth surfaced. That image fueled him, steadied him. He could already hear the silence that would fall, the disbelief, the crumbling of arrogance. That moment would be the justice he had long been denied. As the night stretched deeper, he organized the desk, lining up the documents with military precision. Each folder was a soldier, each page a bullet. The weight of the betrayal no longer crushed him. It armed him. What they thought would be his undoing was about to become his greatest weapon. When the clock chimed in the hallway, he barely noticed. Time no longer mattered. He had found his course, and nothing would move him from it. His hands no longer trembled as he locked the desk and extinguished the lamp. The fire inside him was steady, unyielding. The plan had been born, and with it came the certainty that he would not be erased. He climbed the stairs, the house silent around him, but this time the silence was not heavy. It was waiting like he was. He paused once more at the family photograph on the wall. The smiles no longer mocked him. They looked like masks finally ready to be torn away. And as he reached the landing, his steps steady, he knew one truth above all else: the plan was in motion, and nothing would ever be the same again. They thought he was finished. They thought the years had worn him down into something fragile, something forgettable. They mistook his silence for confusion, his patience for weakness. But as he stood alone in that dimly lit room, the weight of his own history laid out before him in carefully preserved papers, he felt sharper than he had in decades. His mind was clear, his instincts honed. Age had not stolen his strength. It had distilled it, boiled it down until only the essence remained. And that essence was dangerous. He sat at the desk, running his fingers over the embossed seal of the house deed, his name carved into it like stone. They believed he was stumbling toward irrelevance, yet here was proof that everything still rested on him. They whispered about nursing homes, about moving him aside, but those whispers had been born of arrogance. They had forgotten that the same man who had once carried their futures on his back was still very much alive. His body may have bent with time, but his mind cut like a blade. He leaned back in his chair and let the memories surge. Nights balancing bills with trembling hands, days spent building furniture with raw palms, sacrifices made with a steady will. All of it had sharpened him. Experience was not a weakness, it was a weapon. And while they dismissed him as irrelevant, he understood something they never would. Power lies not in age, but in knowledge, in patience, in the ability to endure long enough to strike when no one expects it. He rose and crossed the room, his steps deliberate, every movement reminding him of the control he still possessed. His son saw only an old man slow and quiet, but that perception was the greatest advantage of all. They would never see him coming. The years had taught him to mask his intent, to wait, to bide his time. They had sharpened his ability to read people, to anticipate their moves before they even made them. And now all of that clarity surged into focus. At the window he stared into the night, the street lamps burning like beacons. His reflection stared back at him, lined with years, but his eyes gleamed with something alive, something defiant. He whispered to himself, testing the sound of his own voice, "I am not done." The words felt like iron in his mouth, unbreakable. He turned away and scanned the room again. The furniture, the photographs, the shelves of books, all of it stood as evidence of a life lived fully, and they thought they could erase that with signatures on a few documents. He almost laughed at the absurdity. They underestimated him, not because he had failed them, but because he had succeeded too well. He had made their lives so easy, so secure, that they no longer saw the man who had fought tooth and nail to make it possible. That blindness would be their undoing. He moved back to the desk and unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside, tucked neatly in envelopes, were letters his wife had written over the years, letters of encouragement, reminders of the strength she saw in him. He unfolded one, the ink slightly faded, but the words still sharp. "You are stronger than you know. Don't ever let them take that from you." He read the line twice, then slid the letter back carefully. She had known even then that this day might come, and she had armed him with more than just love. She had given him conviction. The fire inside him no longer burned wildly. It was contained now like molten steel ready to be shaped. He sat again, pulling a notepad toward him, and began to write. Not frantic notes, not desperate scrawls, but measured lines, deliberate and precise. Names, dates, accounts, leverage points. Each word was a piece of the strategy forming in his mind. Each sentence carried the weight of a man fully aware of the power he still held. He paused, letting his pen rest, and thought of his son. He pictured him leaning back in comfort, certain that his father's decline was inevitable. That certainty would be shattered soon. The day was coming when his son would realize the man he dismissed as weak was the one who still held the keys, the one who could unravel everything with a single decision. That day would be his lesson, his reckoning. The house seemed to breathe with him, the silence no longer oppressive, but charged. Even the tick of the clock felt like an ally now counting down, not to his erasure, but to his return. He understood something his son never could. Survival is not about youth or speed. It is about endurance, about waiting until the moment is right to remind the world who you truly are. He gathered the folders once more, placing them neatly back into the safe. The click of the lock was final, reassuring. His son believed he had hidden strength left to summon, but the truth was simpler that strength had never left him. It had only been waiting quiet and steady for the right time to reemerge. He stood tall, his shoulders set, his chest rising with calm resolve. They thought him frail, a relic, but he was sharper than ever. He had clarity, he had control, and he had something they did not experience, tempered by betrayal. And betrayal once endured becomes the sharpest weapon of all. As he turned off the light and the room sank back into darkness, he felt the fire inside him steady like a heartbeat. They thought he was fading. They thought he was finished. But they were wrong. What came next would show them exactly how wrong. And when it arrived, there would be no mistaking who still held the true power in this house. Her words rose from the depths of memory with the force of a commandment. They weren't soft whispers of comfort. They were sharp, deliberate, forged in the steel of her unwavering belief in him. Don't ever let anyone take your dignity. He could still see her face when she said it, the determination in her eyes, the way her hand had gripped his as if transferring that strength directly into his blood. For years he had carried those words like a quiet prayer, but now they returned as a rallying cry. In that moment his shame dissolved, and something far older, far stronger, surged back into his chest pride. He rose from the chair with the kind of authority that came not from youth, but from endurance. His back straightened, his shoulders squared, his presence filling the room once more. The air itself seemed to shift as if recognizing that the man who had built this house, who had carved a life out of hardship, had reclaimed the part of himself betrayal had tried to bury. He was no longer an old man bowed by sorrow. He was a father, a husband, a builder, a man whose name carried weight on every deed and every sacrifice that made this house stand. His gaze fell again on the photograph on the wall, but this time he didn't see ghosts mocking him. He saw proof of what he had been, what he still was. His wife's smile in that frame was no longer painful. It was fuel. She had trusted him with more than her love. She had trusted him with the legacy of their life together. He would not betray that trust by surrendering. He touched the frame lightly, and instead of grief, pride swelled in his chest. He walked through the house like a king reclaiming his throne. Every object, every scar on the floorboards, every dent in the walls became evidence of his dominion. The piano in the corner, though silent, was his. The kitchen table, though scarred, was his. Even the cracks in the ceiling bore witness to the years of storms he had endured. They were not imperfections. They were marks of survival. His house was not a prize to be divided. It was the monument of his life, and he would not allow anyone, even his own son, to desecrate it. As he moved from room to room, he felt his pride returning in waves. He remembered working 2 jobs, dragging himself home with sore muscles, but still finding the strength to play catch in the yard. He remembered the day he and his wife signed the papers for the house, her eyes bright with joy as she whispered, "We did it." He remembered the small victories, the mortgage payments cleared one by one, the first fresh coat of paint after years of saving, the laughter that once rolled through these rooms like thunder. Those memories were not weaknesses. They were the bricks of his identity, and he would not let anyone strip them away. The betrayal no longer crushed him. It defined his battlefield. If they saw him as weak, then they had underestimated the pride of a man who had built a life from nothing. He realized now that pride was not arrogance. It was dignity. It was the recognition of worth. His son had tried to steal that worth with whispers to reduce him to an obstacle, a burden. But his wife's words echoed louder than any insult. Dignity is never given. It is defended. He returned to the study, his steps steady. The documents in the safe were more than paper, they were validation. They proved that everything they wanted still belonged to him. He opened the safe once more, not out of fear this time, but with the calm authority of a man reviewing his arsenal. He placed each folder neatly on the desk, the light catching the embossed seals. His pride surged as he saw his name again and again stamped in black ink, undeniable. No whispered plan could erase those signatures. No conspiracy could undo the permanence of the truth. He sat down and began to write. Not frantic notes this time, but declarations, reminders, affirmations of the control he held. He wrote his wife's words at the top of the page, underlining them with a firm hand. He listed the accounts, the deeds, the investments. He outlined the steps he would take to secure them, to ensure that when the time came, his son would realize just how thoroughly he had misjudged the man he thought broken. The more he wrote, the stronger he felt. His pride was not just personal, it was ancestral. He thought of his own father, a man who had worked himself to the bone in silence, and his grandfather before that. Men who endured wars, poverty, hardship, but never bowed their heads in shame. That blood ran through him, still steady and unyielding. He was not the end of their line. He was the continuation, and he would not let the chain break here. The night grew deeper, but he did not tire. His pride sustained him, filling him with a strength he thought had been lost to age. He stood again, walking to the window. The reflection that stared back was not frail. It was fierce. The lines on his face were not signs of weakness, but of battles survived. His eyes burned with the same fire that had once convinced a young woman to marry him, the same fire that had built a family and a home from nothing. That fire was back, and it was not going out again. He turned from the window, his decision carved into his heart. They would not take his dignity. They would not erase him from the life he had built. His pride had returned, and with it came the certainty that what followed would not just be defense. It would be a reckoning. The clock struck the hour, the sound echoing through the house. To him, it was not a reminder of time running out. It was a signal, a drumbeat announcing the start of something new. He sat once more, folding his wife's words into his mind like armor. What came next would not just restore his dignity. It would prove to everyone who had doubted him that his pride was not a relic of the past, but the force that would define the future. And when that future arrived, it would not be gentle. It would be sharp, undeniable, and final. The bitterness pressed against his ribs like a vice, sharp and unrelenting. His chest ached with the weight of betrayal, the memory of his son's words still raw, still cutting deeper than any blade could. Yet beneath that sting, something else stirred, an ember of hope that refused to die out. It was fragile, yes, but it flickered steadily, daring him to believe that he was not yet defeated. He had been broken open by grief, humiliated by whispers, cornered in his own home, but he could still feel the pulse of possibility. It was faint, but it was there, reminding him that the story was not finished, that his role had not been reduced to silence. He leaned against the desk, his hand pressed to the cool surface, and let the truth settle over him. His son had underestimated him. That was not just an insult, it was an opening. Every assumption his son had made, every dismissive glance, every whispered plan had created blind spots, and blind spots were opportunities. He could almost hear his wife's voice, calm and steady, as always, telling him that loss did not mean defeat. "You're still here," she would have said, "and as long as you're here, you can still fight." The realization was both painful and liberating. It hurt to acknowledge how far he had fallen in his son's eyes, to admit that the boy he had raised now saw him as nothing but an inconvenience. That pain was sharp, acidic, cutting through him. But it also cleared the fog, carving space for resolve. Pain became the backdrop against which hope shone brighter, more defiant. It told him he still had choices, still had tools, still had time. He sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath him, and looked again at the documents spread across the desk. Deeds, accounts, records, all of it. Evidence that his son's narrative was a lie. The old man was not powerless. The old man was not irrelevant. He had resources, carefully tucked away allies who still respected him, and above all, the will to act. Every page he touched reminded him that the game was not over. The bitterness in his chest eased slightly, replaced by a steadier rhythm in his pulse. He thought of the years ahead, not as an endless corridor of decline, but as terrain to navigate, ground still worth claiming. The betrayal of his son had scarred him. Yes, but scars are proof of survival. He could survive this too. And more than that, he could turn it around. He would not let his legacy be rewritten as a story of weakness. He had built too much sacrifice, too much to allow that lie to stand unchallenged. The house seemed to shift around him as though listening. The silence was no longer suffocating but waiting. He walked back into the living room, his steps slow but steady, and stared at the photograph once more. The smiles in the frame still cut him, but now they also reminded him of what he was fighting for. His wife's faith, the love that had filled those walls, the dignity that had defined their life together, it was all still there waiting to be defended. The bitterness reminded him of what was lost. The hope reminded him of what could still be reclaimed. He sat in his armchair, the leather groaning under his weight, and let his mind sharpen. He pictured his son's face when the truth would come crashing down, when the arrogance would falter, when the carefully constructed illusion of control would fracture. That vision was no fantasy. It was a plan forming, a goal solidifying. The bitterness gave him the edge, the hope gave him the patience, and together they became something unstoppable. The night stretched on shadows crawling across the walls, but he did not waver. He had felt humiliation, betrayal, shame so deep it threatened to hollow him out. Yet here he was still breathing, still thinking, still plotting. That alone was proof enough he was not finished. Not by a long shot. His pain had not destroyed him. It had forged him into something harder, something sharper. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the sounds of the house wash over him, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the clock ticking like a heartbeat, the groan of the old pipes. They were familiar grounding reminders that the world had not ended. It was still here waiting for him to act. He opened his eyes again, and there was no haze, no despair clouding them. Only determination. The bitterness remained a sharp edge he could not dull, but it no longer paralyzed him. It fueled him. And the hope, small, stubborn, unyielding, guided his steps. Together they formed a strange partnership, one that would drive him forward. He whispered softly into the room, not a plea, but a vow he would not be erased. He rose once more, his shadow stretching across the room, taller now than it had seemed in years. The man who had been dismissed, underestimated, and nearly discarded was still here, still armed with knowledge and resolve. He would take the pain, take the bitterness, take the shame, and transform them into strength. And as the house settled into its midnight silence, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: the next move would be his, and it would change everything. The silence stretched thick as smoke, wrapping itself around the house, until even the walls seemed to hold their breath. He did not rush to confront, did not storm down the hallway demanding answers. Instead, he sat back in his chair, spine straight, face carved into stone, and allowed the quiet to speak for him. It was not weakness. It was power, the kind of power that builds pressure slowly, invisibly, until the very air trembles with the threat of collapse. His son thought silence meant defeat. He was wrong. This silence was sharper than any word, heavier than any argument, and when it finally broke, it would not be with noise, but with devastation. He had learned long ago that words are fragile, easily dismissed, twisted, or ignored, but silence, true, deliberate silence, had a weight that crushed arrogance. It lingered in rooms like an uninvited guest, forcing others to fill it, to stumble into confessions they never intended to speak. His silence now was not submission. It was the rope tightening, invisible but relentless, preparing to pull the mask from their faces at the moment they least expected. He moved through the house without a word, his steps measured, deliberate. In the kitchen, he opened a drawer, closing it softly, the sound echoing like a warning. In the hallway, he adjusted the crooked photograph, the small click of glass against wood reverberating louder than any argument. Every movement was calculated, every pause intentional. He wanted them to feel it, to sense that something was coming, though they could not name it. Silence, when wielded with purpose, becomes a storm, gathering behind a mountain unseen but undeniable. His son, smug in his whispered plots, mistook that silence for surrender. That was the beauty of it. Let him believe his father was too weary to fight, too broken to resist. Let him continue weaving plans in the dark, confident the old man had no strength left. Every arrogant assumption only tightened the noose. When the truth emerged, it would fall with the force of thunder shattering the calm they thought they controlled. The night pressed deeper, and the house seemed to lean into his silence. The clock ticked louder, the pipes groaned under the weight of time, the floorboards creaked as if shifting nervously. Even the shadows seemed uneasy, lengthening and recoiling, aware that the stillness they cloaked was not passive but dangerous. Silence had become his weapon, his shield, and his strategy. He thought of the arguments he could have made, the shouts, the accusations, the desperate pleading for respect. All of it would have been wasted. Words would only have given them something to twist, to dismiss with smug smiles. But silence gave them nothing. It forced them to face their own thoughts, to question their own moves. Silence was the reflection in the mirror they tried to avoid. And soon that reflection would turn on them. He returned to the study, the safe humming quietly in the corner like a loyal ally. He opened it again, laid the documents out, and studied them with a calm that bordered on terrifying. Each page was a weapon, but he would not wave it in their faces yet. No, the documents would stay hidden until the exact moment when arrogance tipped into collapse. Silence would carry him there. Silence would hold the line, and silence would make the revelation devastating. As he stacked the folders neatly and locked them away, he imagined the confrontation to come. Not a shouting match, not a desperate plea, but a revelation dropped into silence like a stone into still water. The ripples would spread instantly, shattering illusions, drowning lies. He could almost see the look in his son's eyes, the flicker of confusion giving way to dread as the truth crushed him without a word spoken. That moment would be worth every second of quiet now. He sat again, folding his hands on the desk, and let the silence deepen. It was not empty. It was alive, vibrating with potential, waiting for the right spark to detonate. His son thought the old man's silence meant defeat. Soon he would understand that silence is the prelude to the loudest sound in the world, the collapse of everything built on deceit. The house grew still, the night stretching thin, but he did not move, did not falter. His silence filled the space like smoke in a sealed room, invisible but suffocating. He knew that when dawn came, when the game began to shift, this silence would be remembered. It would haunt every corner, every whispered word, until the truth arrived with the weight of inevitability. And when that truth came, it would not need to be shouted. It would not need to be explained. It would fall into the silence like lightning into dry earth, and it would set everything ablaze. The realization settled over him with the force of thunder. For weeks, maybe months, he had let himself believe he was cornered, powerless, a shadow of the man he once was. But now, as the weight of silence sharpened into clarity, he felt the tide shift. In his hands, quite literally, rested the ace, the unseen weapon his son could never anticipate. The knowledge burned through him like fire, steady and unstoppable. He was no longer the man waiting to be discarded. He was the one holding the matchbox in a house soaked with gasoline. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the desk where the papers lay hidden just beneath the wood locked away and secure. Each signature, each record, each deed was not just ink on a page. It was a shield, a sword, a reminder that the legacy his son thought he controlled was still tethered to his father's name. It was almost poetic the way arrogance blinds a man. His son, so confident in whispers and secret meetings, had no idea that the foundation he stood on was already trembling, waiting for the right strike to send it crumbling into dust. He rose slowly, deliberately, and walked through the house with a steadiness that felt different than before. He was not pacing now. He was surveying. The walls no longer pressed against him with the weight of loneliness. They bowed to him, recognized him as their master. The photographs, the furniture, even the floorboards that groaned under his steps, all of it belonged to him, not his son. And the proof of that belonging was locked safely under his hand. The power he thought lost had returned heavier and more absolute than ever. At the window he stared out at the night. The street lamps burned pale circles into the pavement, the shadows shifting between them like uneasy conspirators. He thought of his son's smug expression, the way his voice lowered when he thought his father wasn't listening, the casual cruelty in every word. That arrogance would soon meet the brick wall of truth, and when it did, the silence would shatter, with a sound more devastating than any shout. He turned back to the room, his mind alive with possibilities. Power was not only about possession, it was about timing. He had the ace, yes, but an ace revealed too soon is just another card. His son needed to believe he had won to lean so far into victory that retreat became impossible. Only then would the revelation crush him completely. Patience would be his weapon now. The longer he waited, the deeper his son would dig his own grave. He returned to the study, opening the safe once more. The metallic click echoed like a gun being cocked. He pulled out the deed, laying it flat on the desk, and let his fingers rest on the paper. The embossed seal caught the lamplight, glimmering faintly, almost mocking in its simplicity. This one document alone could unravel every scheme, every whispered plan. He imagined the moment he would place it on the table before his son, the silence that would follow, the shock that would bleed across his face. That image fueled him more than any memory, more than any vow. He organized the other papers, stacking them neatly, aligning them with care. Savings accounts, insurance policies, investments his son didn't know existed, each one a nail in this coffin of arrogance. He smiled faintly, not out of joy, but out of cold certainty. The man they thought was weak had been underestimated, and underestimation was the deadliest mistake of all. For the first time in weeks, his chest felt lighter. Not because the betrayal had vanished, it still cut, still burned, but because he had rediscovered what they had tried to bury: control, dignity, authority. They had tried to strip him of it, but it was his all along. It had simply been waiting for him to remember, and now that he had nothing could take it away. He locked the papers back in the safe, the metallic snap final reassuring. The game was his to command now, and the pieces would move at his pace. He walked to the living room once more, lowering himself into the armchair, and stared at the photograph on the wall. This time he did not see a family torn apart. He saw opponents who did not yet realize they were already defeated. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the quiet of despair. It was the quiet before a storm, the charged stillness of power restrained. His son believed he held the reins, but in truth he was galloping blind, racing toward a cliff. The old man sat steady, the ace in his pocket, waiting for the precise moment to pull it free. And when that moment came, it would not be with fury or shouting. It would be with calm, devastating certainty. A single paper placed on a table. A truth revealed at the perfect time. A silence broken, not by noise, but by the collapse of everything built on arrogance. The fire inside him burned steady as he closed his eyes for a moment, letting the vision settle. He was no longer at the mercy of betrayal. He was the architect of what came next. What came next would not just reclaim his dignity. It would prove beyond doubt that the man they had dismissed still held the power to change everything. He no longer trembled. The weight of humiliation that once pressed on his shoulders had been stripped away, burned into ash by the fire of betrayal. What replaced it was not rage boiling over, not the frantic pulse of a man consumed by anger, but a steady calm that settled deep into his bones. He sat there in the dim light, lips curling into a thin, cold smile, a smile that carried no warmth, no forgiveness. It was the expression of a man who knew the reckoning had only begun, that the path ahead would not end in his defeat, but in theirs. The calm was more dangerous than fury. Fury could be reckless, loud, blind. But calm was deliberate, precise, surgical. His hands no longer shook when he touched the documents, his voice no longer cracked when he spoke aloud to the empty room. He felt steady, grounded, as though betrayal had stripped away every weakness and left behind only steel. They thought they had broken him. Instead, they had delivered him into clarity, carved away the illusions until all that remained was resolve. He leaned back in the chair, the leather groaning softly, and let the silence stretch. It was not the silence of surrender, but of strategy. He thought of his son's smug laughter, the whispered plans traded in secret, the arrogance in every tone. A younger version of himself might have stormed into the room, demanded explanations, shouted until his voice failed. But that man was gone. The one sitting here now understood the value of patience. Justice did not always come with noise. Sometimes it came quietly, like a blade slipping between ribs. He stood and moved slowly through the house, his shadow stretching long against the walls. Each step was deliberate, each pause a reminder that this home was his, that its foundations had been built by his sacrifice. He trailed his hand along the staircase railing, the wood smooth from years of use, and remembered sanding it down with his own hands, his wife laughing as she painted the walls nearby. Every board beneath his feet whispered of effort, of love, of years they had poured into this place. And now, with a smile cold and sharp, he vowed none of it would be stolen. In the kitchen, he opened the drawer where his wife's recipe cards still sat. He picked one up, tracing the faded ink of her handwriting. Apple pie. It read the loops of her letters, graceful, alive. For a moment the bitterness in his chest softened, replaced by the memory of her humming while the oven warmed the house. He pressed the card gently against the table, whispering to her memory that their legacy was safe, that he would not allow betrayal to desecrate what they had built. The smile returned, harder now, colder, for he knew that those who had mocked his silence would soon choke on it. He closed the drawer and walked back to the study, locking it behind him. The safe sat in the corner, humming with secrets. He opened it once more, not to reassure himself, he no longer needed reassurance, but to savor the inevitability of what was coming. The documents stared back at him, his name inked across them in bold letters. He picked up the house deed, holding it as though it were both weapon and shield. His son's ignorance was almost laughable. The boy believed he had cornered his father when in truth he had only trapped himself. Placing the papers back, he locked the safe with a crisp click, the sound final and satisfying. He sat again at the desk and began to write. This time his notes were not frantic scribbles but measured lines of preparation. He listed the accounts, the allies, the phone calls he would make. He outlined scenarios, responses, strategies. Every detail was methodical, precise. His hand moved with calm certainty, each stroke of the pen a declaration that the war had already turned in his favor. The cold smile deepened as he imagined the future. His son sitting at the table, certain he had won, only to watch the truth unfold like a guillotine blade above his head. The silence would be deafening. Then the arrogance drained from his face, replaced by fear. That moment would be worth every second of suffering, every night spent in doubt. That moment would restore the dignity they had tried to strip from him. The house grew still around him, but the stillness no longer weighed heavy. It was electric, alive with promise. The quiet no longer suffocated. It sharpened him. Even the ticking of the clock felt like an ally now, each second bringing him closer to the inevitable collapse of their schemes. He let the sound settle into his chest, steady and reassuring. Time was no longer against him. Time was his accomplice. He rose and walked to the window once more, staring at his reflection in the glass. The man who looked back at him was older, yes, lined with years, but his eyes were bright, burning with cold fire. He smiled again, that same sharp curve of the lips, and in that reflection he saw not weakness, but command. This was not a man waiting for pity. This was a man who had been underestimated, and who would soon reveal just how costly that mistake was. He turned off the lamp, plunging the room into shadow, and moved through the house with measured steps. The silence followed him, not heavy but purposeful, like a loyal hound waiting for its master's command. He paused once more at the family photograph on the wall. The faces in it no longer mocked him. They were masks soon to be torn away. And as he stood there, his smile faint but unshakable, he knew the truth with perfect clarity. The reckoning had only begun. Their betrayal had given him pain, but pain had given him strength. And now strength had given him patience. What came next would not be fury unleashed in chaos. It would be calm, cold, and absolute. The kind of calm that breaks men before they realize they are already broken. He understood now that justice was not always robed in black or handed down from a bench. Sometimes it lived in the quiet certainty of a man who refused to be erased, who carried the truth like a weapon in his chest and the determination to wield it without hesitation. He no longer needed the approval of courts or the sympathy of outsiders. The betrayal had already delivered its verdict, and his task was not to appeal, but to enforce. His belief, hardened into steel justice, could be made real by one man's will, and that man was him. He sat once more at the desk, staring at the stack of papers that glimmered faintly under the lamplight. They were more than documents. They were evidence irrefutable and binding. Each page was a testimony to his life's work, each signature a reminder that his hand still carried weight. His son might scoff at morality, but he could not scoff at the law of ink and seal. And when those papers surfaced, the truth would not just be spoken, it would be undeniable. The power of truth was cold, absolute, and he would use it with precision. Yet it was not only the papers that gave him strength. It was the knowledge that he had nothing left to lose. His dignity had been stripped. His love betrayed, his sacrifices mocked. They thought they had emptied him, but in doing so they had freed him from fear. What more could they take? With fear gone, he had nothing but resolve. And resolve was a weapon sharper than any blade. He leaned back in the chair, letting the silence hum around him, and thought of all the times he had put his trust in others. Trust in employers who promised loyalty and delivered layoffs. Trust in neighbors who borrowed and never repaid. Trust in a son who grew into a man with greed in his eyes. That trust had been shattered again and again. But faith in himself, that was something no betrayal could touch. And now that faith burned stronger than ever. He stood and moved toward the living room, his footsteps echoing steady against the floorboards. The photograph on the wall met his gaze again, but he no longer looked at it with grief. Instead, he studied it like a relic of what was a reminder of the moment before the mask slipped. His wife's smile was still there, alive in the frame, and he whispered to her memory that he had not forgotten her words. Dignity was his to guard, and guard it he would. That belief was no longer just memory, it was mission. Walking through the house, he saw it differently now. Not as a place that trapped him, not as walls closing in, but as a fortress, a stage, a weapon in its own right. The furniture, the floors, the very bricks held stories that were his alone to tell. His son might see them as assets, items to be listed and sold, but to him they were proof. And proof, when wielded correctly, became justice. In the kitchen, he pulled out a chair and sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. He imagined his son sitting across from him, arrogant, dismissive, convinced of his victory. He imagined sliding the deed across the table, his name bold and clear. No raised voice, no arguments, just the silent weight of the truth, crushing arrogance into dust. That vision carried him, steadied him, convinced him that justice was not some distant dream. It was close, waiting to be enacted. He rose again, moving back to the study, and began to write. Not just plans this time, but words that would one day be spoken sentences, that would slice through lies like glass. He drafted a letter, its tone calm but devastating, each line chosen with care. He wrote of sacrifices made of truths, hidden of power, still in his grasp. He did not know yet when he would send it, but the act of writing was enough. It was the voice of justice alive on the page, undeniable. The night deepened, shadows stretching long, but he no longer felt their weight. He was not a prisoner of darkness. He was the one shaping it, bending it to his will. The silence that once suffocated him was now his ally, heavy with promise. He had truth on his side, he had patience, and he had the determination of a father betrayed one time too many. That combination was more powerful than any courtroom, more final than any judge's gavel. At the window, he looked out again at the empty street. Once it had been the path he paced while waiting for his son to come home safely. Now it was the path that would lead his son into the reckoning he had crafted. The lamplight flickered faintly on the pavement, but he did not see weakness there. He saw inevitability. He turned back to the room, his reflection shadowed in the glass, and smiled faintly. It was not the cold smile of earlier born of bitterness. but something sharper. The smile of a man who believed fully and without doubt that justice would be his. Not because it was handed down to him, but because he would take it with his own hands. The house grew quiet again, but now the quiet felt charged, as though it too waited for the moment when the silence would break. He closed the safe with a final echoing snap and sat back in his chair, steady as stone. His wife's words lingered in his ears. His son's arrogance burned in his memory, and his own belief carried him forward like a tide. What came next would not be decided by courtrooms or lawyers. It would be decided here in this house by the man they had underestimated, and when the truth was unleashed, it would not just be justice. It would be a reckoning no one could escape. This was only the beginning. The quiet halls of the house trembled with a storm no one else could yet see. A storm that had been forged from betrayal, sharpened by silence, and fueled by a father's unbreakable will. They thought they had reduced him to a shadow, a man waiting to be erased, but the truth was far darker, far sharper. Beneath the lines of his face, behind the stillness of his movements, lay a force his son had never imagined. He had been underestimated, dismissed, discarded, and that mistake would cost them everything. The papers, the deeds, the records hidden away were not just ink on parchment. They were weapons, each one carrying the authority of truth, each one bearing his name like a seal of defiance. His son believed the game was already won, but that belief was a mask about to shatter. The reckoning would not come with rage, but with precision, with the calm authority of a man who knows exactly when and where to strike. And when it came, it would not simply humble, it would annihilate. Every moment of betrayal had been transformed into fuel. Every whispered insult, every smug plan, every arrogant dismissal had become the building blocks of his revenge. He had listened in silence, he had endured humiliation, but now that silence was over. Now the silence was a weapon, and when it finally broke, it would roar louder than thunder. The man they thought was powerless would stand unshaken, and the ones who had conspired against him would find themselves crushed beneath the weight of their own arrogance. To those watching, to those listening, this is not just a story of betrayal. It is a story of transformation, of a man who was pushed into the shadows, only to emerge sharper, colder, and more dangerous than ever. It is proof that dignity once threatened does not wither, it hardens into steel, and that steel once drawn cuts deeper than any wound caused by greed or lies. So do not look away. Stay until the end. Watch how a father once thought weak and expendable turns the tide with nothing but patience, truth, and resolve. Witness how betrayal is repaid, not with pleading or surrender, but with the kind of justice that leaves no escape. This is not the end of his story. This is the opening move. And by the time the final card is played, the betrayer will not just lose. He will kneel. Follow to the end, because the moment of reckoning is coming. And when it arrives, you will see how a man stripped of everything can rise from the ashes, turn silence into power, and force the one who betrayed him to bow before the truth. This is only the beginning. Stay watch and witness the reversal. No one believed possible. Life has a way of testing us through betrayal, disappointment, and moments when even our own family seems to turn away. The story of this father reminds us that dignity is not something others grant us. It is something we carry within and protect fiercely. Age may bring wrinkles to the skin, but it also sharpens wisdom and endurance. When underestimated, we often discover strengths we forgot. We had patience, resilience, and the quiet power of truth. This tale teaches that silence can be stronger than words, that preparation and self-belief are more effective than anger, and that justice does not always come from a courtroom, but from standing firm in who we are. For older adults, it is a reminder that life is not over simply because others say so. Every day we still have the chance to claim respect, to fight for our place, and to prove that years of sacrifice were never in vain. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the powerful ending of this journey and many more stories that speak to the heart.